The time has come to fulfill all that was spoken and done in the Old Testament. The Passover lamb is about to be offered, or rather, to offer himself as both high priest and sacrifice. Masterful political games are being played by the Jewish elders and chief priests in order to have Jesus crucified by the Romans. The judge of the universe is judged by his own creation. The king of the angels is crowned with a wreath of thorns. He who wrapped the heavens with clouds is wrapped with the purple of mockery. The bridegroom of the church is beaten and scourged. The end is near. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times while Jesus was standing before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish elders led by Caiaphas, the high priest. While he was in there, the guards were beating, spitting on, and mocking Jesus. Roman governors appointed the high priest every year, ensuring his cooperation with Rome. Choosing the high priest also created an opportunity for financial gain for the governor, who could look forward to an annual bribe. On this particular year, Caiaphas was the high priest. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who was sometimes also referred to as the high priest. Annas was passing down the position to his son-in-law, who was acting as the high priest, but Annas was still manipulating things behind the scenes. When morning came, the elders of the council came together and began to interrogate Jesus. The chief priests and his council sought to stop Jesus because they perceived his presence to be a threat to them. If Jesus were to start a riot and the people rebelled against the Romans, as many, especially the group known as the Zealots, wanted, the temple leaders were in danger of being replaced by the Romans for another group of leaders. Of course, the Sanhedrin could not turn the Jewish people against Jesus by telling them that he wanted to overthrow the Romans, because that is what the people wanted, although to be clear, Jesus had no intention of taking down the Romans. They could not reveal their true intentions of preserving their power, so they needed to bring down Jesus from a religious perspective. The high priest's family were hardly worried about pleasing God, as they had made a mockery of the temple, which Jesus had exposed a few days prior. If the chief priests would be successful in getting Jesus crucified, he knew that the people would then reject Jesus as the Messiah, since anyone who hangs on a tree would be considered cursed, according to a prophecy from Deuteronomy. They sought to have Jesus killed on the basis of blasphemy, according to Jewish law, and since blasphemy against Jewish law was not a basis for execution under Roman law, to accuse him of treason to the Romans. To make their case, the chief priests and elders sought false testimony against Jesus. In Jewish law, a second person had to independently confirm the claims that another was making, so they were unable to make anything stick against Jesus. Finally, 2 men came forward saying, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." When asked to answer this allegation, Jesus remained silent. Jesus had not actually said these words, but something similar, which the Jews misunderstood and took out of context. Jesus had made a statement about destroying this temple, meaning his body, since he knew that they would kill him. They took what Christ said as a threat that he would destroy the temple. Even in their misunderstanding of Jesus' statement, they did not take him seriously, since they answered that it took 46 years to build the temple. Jesus could have saved himself by correcting the incorrect charge against him, but he remained silent because he knew it was his time. This also fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. As a sheep led to the slaughter, and like a blameless lamb is dumb, he opened not his mouth. Caiaphas put Jesus under an oath, which was a legal technique used to force the truth, and no one could remain silent in order to not incriminate themselves. If someone lied, they would be subject to divine punishment. But if he remained silent, he could be found guilty just on the basis of his silence. Each of the synoptic accounts of the gospel posed the question and answer session from Caiaphas and Christ a little different, but they all establish the same thing. In the gospel according to St. Mark, Caiaphas asks, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Jesus' answer gives the high priest all of the ammunition that he needed to convict him. He used phrases that very clearly identified himself as God. These were all titles from the Old Testament that referred to God. Most specifically, he does not respond yes to the question, but says, I am. This was the name of God that was forbidden by the Pharisees to even speak, yet Jesus Christ is telling them, I am the I am. He also claims to be the Messiah, the Davidic king, and to be the Son of Man, the judge at the end of the world, which we learned from Daniel the prophet. Jesus' answer would have been blasphemy if it weren't true, but since he is God, he was simply telling the truth. Of course, the irreverent high priest's heart was too hard to be able to see Christ's divinity, so instead he tore his clothes, a sign of absolute rage. The council of the Sanhedrin condemned Jesus to death, as some began to spit on him and hit him. Although the Sanhedrin found Jesus guilty, the trial was actually illegal according to Jewish law. Trials were not permitted to take place on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a holy day, that Friday being the eve of both. It was also forbidden to pronounce a guilty verdict on the same day of the trial. This was to avoid a hasty, guilty judgment. All of this happened at night, which was also against Jewish law, since the trial must occur during the day. Perhaps to satisfy this requirement, at morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes met to condemn Jesus, and they led him away to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The chief priests and elders wanted Jesus crucified, which, by law, only the Romans could do. They preferred not to execute Jesus themselves so that the people who followed him would not revolt against them. They also wanted him publicly humiliated to dissuade anyone from following him further. Jesus was led to a place called the Praetorium, which was a courtyard outside of one of the Roman governor's residence near the temple. The governor was the Roman emperor's representative in the region, charged with keeping peace and collecting taxes. Pontius Pilate was the governor during the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate is mentioned in the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed because this gives a definite time frame in history that the crucifixion of Christ took place. He was prefect, or governor, for 10 years, from 26 to 36 AD. Because the Praetorium was a Roman place, the elders and chief priests did not enter, but stayed outside because it was considered unclean by the Jews, and if they had entered, they would not have been able to celebrate the feast of Passover. This is why, as we will see, Pilate questions Jesus in the Praetorium and then goes out to talk to the Jews. The feast of Passover was an especially volatile time in Jerusalem. Passover was the feast where the Jews celebrated their liberation from the Egyptians. The Roman authorities feared the Jews would rebel during this feast, since they desperately wanted to be freed from the Romans. Once again, the evangelists offer different pieces of the puzzle as to how things happened that night. St. John has the most detail concerning the interaction between Jesus and Pilate because he had stuck around Jesus during the entire ordeal. We do not know for sure if he entered the Praetorium or if he stayed outside like the other Jews. Pilate's first question to Jesus, according to St. John, was, "Are you the king of the Jews?" To which Jesus replied with a question, asking Pilate if that question was from him or if someone else put him up to asking. Pilate responds, "Am I a Jew?" Meaning, "Why would I care if you proclaimed yourself to be king of the Jews?" He went on to tell Jesus that his own Jewish people, including the Jewish leadership, handed him over to be killed. He asked Jesus, "What have you done?" Jesus explains that he is a king, but not of this world. Jesus then tells Pilate, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate then asks his now famous question, "What is truth?" For Orthodox Christians, the truth isn't a concept or an ideal. The truth is a person, Jesus Christ. The truth does not change over time or in different locations because Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Pontius Pilate found no fault in Jesus and went out to the chief priests and multitudes and says, "I find no crime in this man." The Jews said, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place." They said this trying to persuade Pilate that Jesus was a troublemaker and that he might cause a riot against the Romans, knowing that this was a fear of the Roman leadership. Upon learning that Jesus was from Galilee, Pilate sent Jesus to Herod the Tetrarch, who happened to be in Jerusalem at the time because of the feast. Jesus had not broken any Roman laws, and Pilate did not want to get involved in inter-Jewish affairs. We remember that Herod was not a Jew himself, but his father, Herod the Great, was appointed king of the entire region in 37 BC. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. After questioning Jesus intensely, Jesus remained silent once again. Herod did not perceive Jesus as a threat of his own kingship because Jesus' reputation was that of a peacemaker and healer. Herod's main desire was in seeing Jesus perform a miracle in front of him as some sort of magic trick. When Jesus would not entertain him, Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus. Then, arraying him in gorgeous apparel, he sent him back to Pilate. They dressed Jesus in purple robes to mock him. Purple was a rare color for fabric in those days because it was very difficult to produce, and that made it very expensive. They were mocking Jesus for being a so-called king, and so they mockingly dressed him up like one. Of course, Herod could spare an expensive robe of his, so long as it would be entertaining for him. We hear in the hymn of the Crucifixion, or the 15th antiphon of the Great and Holy Friday Orthros service, "He who wrapped the heavens with clouds is clothed with the purple of mockery." Another reason that Herod did not want to kill Jesus is that Herod had killed John the Baptist, whom the people considered a prophet and holy man, and they were still mad at Herod for John's death. He did not want to risk upsetting more people over Jesus' death. Having brought Jesus back to Pilate again, Pilate was probably annoyed that he had to deal with this issue again, after he had already proclaimed 3 times that Jesus was innocent from committing any Roman crimes. When he saw that Herod had sent him back, he knew that Herod found him innocent as well. But Pilate knew that he had to get involved or else risk a riot from the mobs of Jews. Pilate thought that he could pacify the Jews by punishing Jesus with scourges instead. Scourging was far worse than whipping. The difference can be likened to being stung by a bee versus being jabbed with a knife. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, in her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, explains the scourging process. Romans administered a scourging with a flagellum, which was far more brutal than a whip. The flagellum had a stubby hand grip that held several strands of leather braided together. About halfway up this portion, the braid separated into individual strands. Each strand had small metal balls attached to it at intervals along its length. The balls made the flesh more tender by repeatedly bruising the person with each stroke. Attached to the end of each strand of leather was a sharp piece of metal that dug into the body. The accused criminal was stripped of his clothes and tied facing a pillar, either with his hands above his head or bent over a lower pillar. St. Romanos the Melodist writes, "Stripped and stretched out on a pillar is he who in a pillar of cloud previously spoke to Moses and Aaron. He who laid the pillars of the earth, as David said, is bound to a pillar." Dr. Constantinou continues, 2 Roman soldiers alternating on the left and right sides struck the accused with a flagellum with full force. With each blow, the victim received multiple wounds to the back, legs, and buttocks. The metal tips at the end of the strands would dig deep into the flesh, tearing the skin, muscles, and nerves, and ripping small blood vessels. The gruesome details continue and get worse, but suffice to say that the punishment left the individual close to death, although the Romans were experts at this type of torture and ensured that the person was not killed during scourging, for the scourging was meant either for punishment or to prepare them for crucifixion so that they would bleed out and die faster on the cross. After the scourging, the soldiers made a crown of thorns and placed it on his head and dressed him again with the purple robes. The crucifixion hymn says, "A crown of thorns crowns him who is the king of the angels. This shows a stark comparison of him who is the king of all creation being mocked by his very own creatures. They mockingly came to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. The Romans' main objective during the Jewish feast of Passover was to avoid a riot. The population of Jerusalem was about 50,000 people during the regular time of year, but up to about 200,000 during Passover, as the Jews would often come as pilgrims to the holy city. Jesus was not guilty of any Roman crimes, but he had been brought to Pilate by high-ranking Jewish leaders and did not want to simply release him, as he told Jesus that he could do, because that would have been taken as a disrespectful decision to the Jewish leaders. On the other hand, Pilate knew that Jesus had gained popularity amongst the people and was in fear that one side or the other might rebel. He had no good options, and so he sought to fix the problem diplomatically. Pilate told the Jews that they had a custom of releasing one prisoner on the feast. Note, this was not a Roman custom, nor did the Romans usually participate in this custom, but Pilate thought that participating in this Jewish custom would show some goodwill towards the Jews, and that he could give them a way to release Jesus while saving face. The elders and chief priests, however, were so close to their goal of ending Jesus, which they had wanted to do for quite some time, that they would have preferred Barabbas, a known criminal, to be freed than to let Jesus go. Barabbas was not a simple robber, but most likely the leader of a zealot religious group, and was responsible for murder during an insurrection. Releasing Barabbas was not good for the Romans, nor for the Jewish leaders. However, the chief priests and elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Most of the Jews were busy preparing for the feast of Passover, as that Friday was a day of preparation. Most of the Jews probably were not aware of what had happened the night before, and that Jesus had been tried before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night, which was illegal, and that he was currently on trial before Pilate. The crowd outside the Praetorium was probably a crowd of random people. Many may have been visitors who were just in town for the Passover, and may not have known who Jesus was. That is why the chief priests and the elders were able to convince them to ask for Barabbas and crucify Jesus. Again, Barabbas was a criminal, most likely against the Romans, and would have been considered a Jewish patriot, and so some of the Jews would have gladly asked for his release. There was also a bit of irony in releasing Barabbas over Jesus. The name Barabbas in Hebrew literally meant the son of the Father. And so a violent criminal who was as opposite of Christ as possible, named Son of the Father, was released over the true Son of the Father. Barabbas was released, but Pilate still had to decide what to do with Jesus, as the coerced crowd continued to call for his crucifixion. Jesus had already been scourged. The Jews clearly told Pilate that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and by their law he must die. Pilate, who was a pagan and believed in multiple gods, questioned in his heart if Jesus was actually a god, and became even more afraid to have him crucified. Pilate had thought that the scourges and mocking would satisfy the Jews, and so he brought out and presented to the Jews a bloodied and humiliated Jesus, once again telling them that he found no crime in him. Pilate exclaimed, "Behold the man!" But the chief priests and officers cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate told them to crucify him themselves, to which they responded, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard these words, he was the more afraid. He entered the Praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Jesus lets Pilate know how much authority he has as God, and that Pilate's authority is permitted by God. By saying, "Therefore, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin," could possibly be referring to two people, Judas or Caiaphas. This statement, by saying, has the greater sin is implying that Pilate also is guilty of sin for Christ's crucifixion. When Pilate had refused again to crucify Jesus and sought to release him, the Jews said, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Friend of Caesar was a title of honor given to Roman leaders. Tiberius Caesar, the current emperor of Rome during that time, had recently executed Roman leaders because of treason, and the chief priests knew about this and used it as a threat against Pontius Pilate. Pilate knew that it was Jesus' life or his own. Pilate ascended the pavement, or Gabbatha, and pronounced his judgment on the judge of the universe.